So around this time of year, naturally, maybe one of our resolutions is to grow in our faith, to maybe practice a little bit more consistently, to pray more, develop my relationship with God a little bit more, which is all wonderful, wonderful things. And often when I think of our development in our faith life, I can't help but call to mind the distinction that's often made, especially in younger people these days. A recent Pew Research poll came out, and it was pretty dismal, in fact, sad, how more and more people are becoming disassociated with religion. And often, especially as a priest, you hear, well, Father, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. I'm spiritual and I'm not religious. I think today's readings, in particular our gospel, it really faces or forces us to come face to face with the revelation of God. You see, oftentimes when somebody makes that claim, as well-intended and good-natured as it may be, I'm spiritual but not religious, what essentially is being done is, I want religion on my terms. I want to be able to connect with God where I want to connect with God. And I don't think the formalized version is necessary. But if you look at what we believe in God and what God shows us in Scripture, you can't reconcile that notion of a relationship with God and what He tells us. You see, spiritual but not religious means on my terms and not anyone else's, and certainly not God's. Why? Because God reveals Himself. And God instructs us on what it is we are to do with that relationship. In fact, that's exactly why it's not just on my terms, because it's a relationship. Imagine doing that in your friendships or your relationship as a spouse. I'll engage in this relationship on my terms. But a relationship takes two. It takes coordination and compromise. That's exactly what a relationship with God is like. He reveals Himself to us, what He wants, and He can do that because He's God, and how we are to respond in kind. So in today's gospel, there's really two stories going on here. The first story that I think can help us to understand what it is that God has done in our lives and what He expects from us. So there's two stories going on. The first is this, and it's an all too familiar story, the story that we hear time and time again. And it's a story of a power-hungry, politically motivated, ambitious ruler who's motivated by greed and holding on to power as long as possible. And the other story is a story of faith and a search for truth that takes time. And I think that, again, these are two stories that we can relate to at some level. It's not hard to see why Herod was someone who is overly occupied or preoccupied with the things of this world. He was concerned with how best to leave his mark and maintain his power, how others were going to judge him and remember him. The Magi, on the other hand, they looked to the sky beyond their immediate world in search of truth. You see, they acknowledged that something was going on in their hearts, but also something was going on in the world that was drawing them to this important revelation of God. So it wasn't on their terms. It was on God's terms. They followed this inner impulse of God that they didn't really understand, but were soon to meet in the flesh the most unexpected person, God Himself. I think that it's obvious that the church wishes us to associate ourselves with the Magi, with the same inward seeking of the Magi that led them to the child in the manger. But maybe there's a part of us that can also relate to Herod and his preoccupation with the things of the world. So there's a good question to ask ourselves, and it's this: what is it that's keeping you and me from progressing on our journey of faith? How is it going living your faith life on your terms? Has it strengthened your relationship with God? And if so, come and tell me so I can learn. But friends, I think maybe this can help us to understand what God does in our lives and what he does in the Magi's hearts in the gospel. So Blessed Columba Marmion is a great Irish monk and one of Mother Teresa's favorite spiritual writers. He writes this about the star in today's gospel. He says, the star is a symbol of the interior illumination that enlightens the soul and calls it to God. I love that. The star, it symbolizes the interior illumination that enlightens the soul and calls it to God. He says that the soul of every person is enlightened like the Magi by a star of a calling to eternal salvation. So in the life of every person, especially the Christian, there's this interior star, if you will, which calls it to Christ. There's a star in our lives and in our hearts and in our souls of divine origin, which guides us in doing God's will, as we progress on our journey of faith. But the trick is, you have to look up to see it. You have to recognize its presence. You know, it's interesting, and this is like a fascinating detail in the gospel. It's interesting to note that in the East, that star that led the Magi to Bethlehem was in the night sky for every single person to see. It wasn't like the Magi were seeing some sort of illusion or this like they were the only ones who had access to the star in the sky. In fact, when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem, it was the chief priests and the scribes in the temple who gave the Magi directions to Bethlehem. Even though the priests, the scribes, and Herod himself knew of the star and what it meant, they chose not to follow it. Imagine how sad that is. We know exactly what you're looking for, Magi. In fact, take a left and then another right, and you'll get exactly where you're going. And what they were to find. But to be honest, again, this is a part of the story that I have such a hard time with. I mean, how is it that the ones who were explaining the prophecy to these foreigners, to the Magi, the ones that direct them to the Bethlehem where they would find Jesus, aren't themselves interested in visiting Bethlehem or paying homage to the Lord? The careful and committed search of the Magi is starkly contrasted with the indifference of the scribes, the priests, and Herod himself. It's as if, although the chief priests, scribes, and Herod, they knew about the star and they saw it themselves, they really didn't want to look up because they were too focused on themselves. So in a similar vein, Pope Benedict XVI, in a homily given on the Feast of the Epiphany, he says this: what is the reason that some see the star and others do not? What is it that opens the eyes of the heart? What is missing in those who will remain indifferent, from those who indicate the way but do not move? We can answer: the excessive certainty in themselves, the pretension of knowing reality perfectly, the presumption of already having formulated a definitive judgment on things, thus making their hearts closed and insensitive to the novelty of God. The former pope continues, they are certain of the idea that they have of the world and do not let themselves be moved in their deepest being by the adventure of a God who wants to meet them. They place more confidence in themselves than in him. And they do not consider it possible that God, being so great, can make himself so small, that he can really come close to us. In the end, what is missing is genuine humility, which is able to submit to what is greater, but also genuine courage that leads one to believe what is really great, even if it is manifested in a defenseless child. And he ends, lacking is the capacity to be children at heart, to be amazed, and to come out of oneself to undertake the way indicated by the star, the way of God. Friends, what he's saying is our ability to acknowledge that guiding light, that star of faith in our hearts and in our soul, it takes humility and courage. Because so much of us in the world says, don't do it, don't follow it. So it's really a test in what you value in life. It's a test of whether or not we allow ourselves to be moved by God, or if we want to write our own ticket. Friends, do we give in to the same temptation that Herod, those priests and scribes did, and avoid looking up at the star in our lives?